The car smells of her, a scent so foreign in this space it feels like a violation. It's a ghost in the machine, this expensive perfume, something floral and impossibly complex, the kind of fragrance that announces a woman's arrival before you even see her. It has soaked into the cheap fabric of my passenger seat, into the collar of my shirt, into my skin. It's the scent of wealth, of power, of a world I had only ever read about, and now it is the undeniable scent of my guilt. Outside, the Brooklyn alley is dark and quiet, a world away from the glittering spire in Manhattan where I just left a piece of my soul. On my phone, the screen glows with a message from Sarah. My Sarah. Where are you? Getting worried. The words are so innocent, so full of a trust I no longer deserve, and they land like a physical blow. I can't type a reply. My fingers feel numb, alien. An hour ago, these same fingers were tangled in hair the color of expensive champagne, tracing the elegant line of a jaw that has commanded boardrooms and broken men. An hour ago, I was pressed against a cold pane of glass 50 floors above the city, my own ragged breath fogging up the view of a million distant lights, the sound of her silk dress pooling on the floor, a soft hiss that will echo in my ears forever. She whispered my name, and in that moment, the boy who left his small town with big dreams simply ceased to exist. In his place is this stranger, this man sitting in a beat-up sedan who smells of another woman, a woman 20 years his senior, a woman who is his boss, his everything, his ruin. I finally killed the screen on my phone, plunging the car back into darkness. Going home isn't an option, not yet. Maybe not ever. The question that burns behind my eyes isn't how this happened. That part, I understand. It was a slow fall, then a sudden plunge. The real question, the one that has no answer, is what happens now. How do you go back to a simple black and white world when you have just tasted a universe of forbidden color? You can't. You can only sit in the dark, breathing in the ghost of her, and accept that you are haunted. Before the scent of her perfume became the ghost in my car, before the taste of whiskey on her lips became my sacrament and my sin, there was only the silence and the steel. The first few weeks of my internship at Vance Capital were an exercise in invisibility. I was one of 20 bright-eyed, terrified young hopefuls, all of us dressed in suits that cost more than we could really afford, all of us trying to look like we belonged in that cathedral of commerce. The office itself was on the 48th floor of a glass tower that scraped the sky above Midtown. It was a world of cool marble, polished chrome, and hushed, important conversations that I was not privy to. My life was a small gray cubicle, a mountain of spreadsheets that made my eyes blur, and the constant, gnawing fear of making a mistake so colossal that I would be sent back to my student apartment in Queens with my tail between my legs. We, the interns, were the plankton of this ecosystem, and the sharks swam in the carpeted executive offices. Their presence felt more than seen. And at the apex of it all, the great white of this ocean, was Eleanor Vance. Her name was a legend before I ever saw her face. The other interns spoke it in whispers. Vance is reviewing the quarterly reports today. Did you hear Vance just closed the Axiom deal? She wasn't Miss Vance or the CEO. She was just Vance, a single, powerful syllable, like a force of nature. They said she had started with nothing and built this empire with her bare hands, that she could smell weakness like a predator, that she hadn't taken a vacation in a decade. I pieced together an image of her from these whispers. A ruthless, obsessed titan, a dragon guarding a hoard of gold. I was perfectly content for this dragon to remain in her lair, far away from my insignificant corner of the kingdom. That all changed on a Tuesday in my third week. We were summoned to the main boardroom for a portfolio review. The air in the room was thick with a nervous energy. Senior analysts, men twice my age with deep-set worry lines, were shuffling their papers and adjusting their ties. I found a seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, trying to make myself as small as possible, a human-shaped chair, a ghost in a cheap suit. Then, the double doors at the head of the room opened, and she walked in. The casual chatter ceased instantly. It wasn't a sound that stopped it, but a presence. The whispers had not done her justice. They had painted a picture of a monster, but the woman who entered the room was a work of art. Eleanor Vance was not beautiful in the way a movie star is beautiful. That is too soft, too common a word. She was magnificent. She was sculpted. I remember thinking of the statues I'd seen at the Met, the goddesses of ancient Greece carved from cold, white marble, perfect and remote and untouchable. That was her. She wore a charcoal gray suit, the kind of tailoring that probably cost more than my car. It wasn't designed to be feminine or alluring. It was armor, a statement of pure, unadulterated authority. Her hair, a cool shade of ash blonde, was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon at the nape of her neck. Not a single strand was out of place. It was the hair of a woman who commanded control over every aspect of her universe, down to the last follicle. She moved to the head of the table with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There were no wasted steps, no fidgeting. Her posture was ramrod straight, radiating a confidence that seemed to be woven into her very DNA. She placed a slim leather portfolio on the table, and her hands, I remember her hands, were graceful, with long fingers and unpainted nails. These were not the hands for idle gestures. They were instruments of power, hands that signed deals, that pointed out flaws, that could probably shatter glass with a single, deliberate tap. She was in her early 40s, and you could see the faint lines of experience around her eyes and mouth, but they weren't marks of age. They were marks of thought, of countless hours spent staring down opponents and wrestling with complex problems. They only added to her formidable aura. Then she looked up, and her eyes swept across the room. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, they passed over me. They were blue, but not the warm blue of a summer sky. They were the cold, clear blue of a frozen lake, deep and analytical. In that 1 second, I felt utterly and completely transparent, as if she could see every insecurity, every ounce of ambition and fear warring within me. I felt like a boy, a clumsy, overgrown boy who had wandered into the court of a queen. I dropped my gaze instantly, my face flushing with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A thought, ugly and unwelcome, flickered in the back of my mind. It was a spark of something I didn't dare name, a raw, primal awe that was so much more than professional respect. It was the feeling a pagan must have had, staring up at the statue of his goddess, knowing he was unworthy to even breathe the same air. She began to speak. Her voice was a low alto, calm and measured, yet it filled the cavernous room effortlessly. She didn't need to raise it. The quiet authority in her tone commanded absolute attention. She began to dissect the first analyst's report, her words like surgical instruments, precise and sharp. The projections in Section 3 are optimistic, Paul. They're based on a market trend that has already peaked. Show me the stress test data. She didn't humiliate him. That would have been too crude for her. Instead, she simply unwrapped his flawed logic layer by layer, with an intellectual prowess that was both terrifying and breathtaking to witness. I sat there, pretending to take notes, but all I was doing was watching her. I watched the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration. I watched the slight, almost imperceptible purse of her lips when she found a detail that displeased her. I watched the way the light from the recessed ceiling fixtures caught the gold of her simple, elegant watch. My girlfriend Sarah was beautiful. She was warm and sunny, full of laughter and soft edges. Her hands were for holding, for baking, for brushing my hair from my eyes. She was real, and I loved her for it. But this woman, this Eleanor Vance, was not real in the same way. She was an ideal. She was power and intelligence and control made flesh. And as I sat there, in that cold boardroom, a dangerous seed was planted in the fertile ground of my young, ambitious heart. It was a desire not for her body, not then, but for something far more intoxicating. It was the desire to be seen by her, to have those ice blue eyes look at me and not look through me, to be deemed worthy. I didn't know it then, but my internship was no longer about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about her. The marble goddess was my new religion, and I, her unwitting first worshiper, was prepared to do anything for a sign of her favor. After that first meeting, she became a fever in my blood. My life, which had previously been governed by deadlines, textbooks, and the simple, comfortable rhythm of my relationship with Sarah was now secretly orbiting a new sun, Eleanor Vance. I began to engineer my days around the possibility of a chance encounter. I learned that she took her coffee from a small, independent cafe 3 blocks from the office at precisely 7:15 a.m., and I started leaving my apartment an hour earlier just to stand in the same line, my heart hammering against my ribs, only to lose my nerve and stare at my shoes when her signature perfume would drift past me. I saw her once in the express elevator, a fleeting moment where we were separated by a dozen other people in dark suits. She was talking quietly into her phone, her voice a low murmur, and I spent the entire ride staring at her reflection in the polished steel doors, memorizing the severe, elegant line of her profile. Each sighting was a jolt, a hit of a drug that left me feeling both euphoric and pathetic. My work became an obsession, but the motivation had shifted. It was no longer about securing a job offer at the end of the summer. It was about building a monument, a piece of work so undeniably brilliant that it would have to, by some law of the universe, cross her desk. I was a man crafting a perfect sacrifice for a distant, unknowable goddess. While the other interns bonded over after-work beers, complaining about the monotony of data entry, I stayed behind. My cubicle became my sanctuary and my watchtower. The office transformed after 7 o'clock. The frantic energy of the day bled away, replaced by a deep, monastic quiet. The sprawling open-plan floor, once a hive of activity, became a ghost town of darkened screens and empty chairs. The only sounds were the distant hum of the building's circulation systems, the soft rattle of the cleaning crew's carts, and the frantic clicking of my keyboard. I would sit there for hours, the city of New York transforming into a glittering tapestry of light outside the vast windows, and I would work. I volunteered for the most tedious, complex assignments, the ones everyone else avoided. One such project landed on my desk in late June. It was a preliminary analysis for a potential acquisition of a mid-size logistics company. It was grunt work, a data dump of financials and operational metrics that needed to be sorted and summarized. For anyone else, it was a week of soul-crushing boredom. For me, it was an opportunity. I did what was asked, of course, but then I went further. I stayed night after night, fueled by lukewarm coffee from the vending machine and a desperate, burning need to impress a woman who barely knew I existed. I built my own financial model from scratch, one far more dynamic than the template we'd been given. I cross-referenced their shipping routes with economic forecasts to project future growth corridors. I dug into their main competitors, creating a risk analysis profile that was not part of the brief. I poured every ounce of my intellect, every lesson from my finance professors, into this single project. The document grew from a simple 10-page summary into a 50-page deep dive, bound and printed, with a care usually reserved for a doctoral thesis. It was close to 11 on a Thursday night when I finally finished. The office was utterly still. I was alone, surrounded by the debris of my obsession. Empty coffee cups, scrawled, on legal pads, and the faint scent of ozone from the overworked printer. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes gritty with exhaustion, and felt a hollow sense of completion. The sacrifice was ready, but the goddess was nowhere to be seen. I began to pack up my bag, a familiar wave of anticlimactic disappointment washing over me, and then I heard it, a sound that cut through the silence like a diamond cutting glass. The soft, steady click of heels on the marble floor of the main corridor. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. It had to be her. No one else walked with that same unhurried, unshakable cadence. I sat frozen, listening to the clicks grow closer. She wasn't walking towards the elevators. She was walking deeper into the office, towards my section. A sliver of light appeared as the door to the intern bullpen swished open, and there she was. She had shed her suit jacket, and the sleeves of her white silk blouse were rolled up to her elbows, revealing slender, toned forearms. Her hair was slightly less perfect than it was in the boardroom, a few blonde strands having escaped the confines of her chignon. In the harsh, fluorescent light of the office, she looked less like a marble statue and more like a real woman, a tired, powerful, achingly real woman. She stopped when she saw the halo of light from my desk lamp in the otherwise dark room, She stood in the doorway for a moment, her expression unreadable. I felt a primal urge to switch off the lamp, to vanish, to hide my pathetic, desperate vigil from her, but I was paralyzed. Her gaze found me, and she tilted her head slightly, a gesture of mild curiosity. "You're here late," she said. Her voice, without the acoustics of the boardroom, was softer, but it still held that same low, resonant timbre that sent a shiver down my spine. "Just finishing something up, Miss Vance," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and reedy to my ears. "What are you working on?" she asked, taking a few steps closer. Her perfume, that same intoxicating scent from the cafe, preceded her, a ghost in the stale office air. The preliminary analysis for the K-Line acquisition," I stammered, my hands suddenly slick with sweat. She stopped beside my cubicle, her hip level with my shoulder. I could feel the heat radiating from her body. "I saw the initial summary from your supervisor," she said. "He seemed to think it was complete." This was it. My moment. My one shot. With a hand that trembled slightly, I picked up the thick, bound report from my desk. I went a little deeper into the data, Miss Vance. I thought there might be more to the story. I held it out to her, an offering. She looked at the report, then at me, her blue eyes analytical. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then, she reached out and took it from my hand, her fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second. It felt like an electric shock. She didn't sit. She stood right there, under the unflattering office lights, and began to read. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched her face, searching for any sign, any flicker of emotion. I watched her eyes move back and forth across the pages I had bled for. I saw her pause at my custom financial model, her brow furrowing slightly. She flipped to the competitor analysis, her thumb tracing the edge of the page. It felt like an eternity. My entire future, not just at this company, but the future I had just decided I wanted, seemed to hang in the balance of her judgment. Finally, she looked up from the report and fixed her gaze on me. "This risk assessment, this wasn't in the brief," she stated, her tone neutral. I swallowed, finding my voice. "No, Miss Vance, but their primary competitor has been aggressively undercutting prices in the Midwest corridor for 2 quarters. I thought it was a material risk that wasn't reflected in K-Line's own projections." She held my gaze, and I refused to look away. I had to prove I wasn't just a child. She nodded slowly. "And this model? It's just a more dynamic sensitivity analysis, to see how a fuel price hike or a labor dispute would impact their margins." She closed the report and held it in her hand. "What's your name?" she asked. "Liam," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Liam Porter." "Liam," she repeated, and the way she said it, the way my name sounded in her low, controlled voice, was like a branding iron on my soul. She had seen me. I was no longer a ghost. She handed the report back to me. "Your valuation is about 2% too high. You're overweighting goodwill and underestimating the integration costs." It was a sharp, clinical criticism, and yet it felt like a gift. She had taken my work seriously enough to critique it. Then, she added, "But your instincts on the risk analysis are sound. You have a good mind, Liam." And then it happened. A small, almost imperceptible thing. The corner of her mouth lifted in a slight upward curve. It wasn't a grin, it wasn't a broad smile. It was a brief thaw, a flicker of genuine warmth in the Arctic expanse of her composure. Her eyes, for just a second, lost their analytical edge and held something that looked like approval. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Go home, Liam," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "The work will be here tomorrow." She turned and walked away, the sound of her heels clicking softly, fading down the corridor until she was gone. I sat there in the humming silence, my body buzzing with an energy that had nothing to do with caffeine. I looked at the report in my hands, the one she had held. I brought my own hand to my face, trying to see if I could still feel the phantom touch of her fingers. The glacier had not melted, but I had seen a crack appear. The goddess had nodded in my direction, and I knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that I would now spend every waking moment trying to make the earth move. That brief, fleeting smile became the fuel for a fire I didn't know I was building. For weeks, my life settled into a new, strange rhythm of obsessive work and watchful waiting. I was no longer just an intern. I was Liam, the boy with the good mind. The other interns noticed the shift. I was given more complex tasks. My opinions were occasionally solicited by junior analysts, and I was included on email chains that were previously far above my pay grade. But I had received no further direct communication from Eleanor. The goddess had returned to her marble pedestal, and I was once again just a face in the crowd, albeit a face she now knew the name of. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, if that moment of warmth had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and caffeine. I was starting to lose hope, sinking back into the quiet desperation of my cubicle. Then, on a sweltering afternoon in July, the email landed in my inbox. It wasn't from a supervisor. It wasn't from HR. The sender was Eleanor Vance. The subject line contained only 2 words: my office. My blood ran cold, then hot. I stood up so quickly my chair rolled back and hit the wall of the cubicle with a loud thud. The entire row of interns looked up. I ignored them, smoothing down my tie with trembling hands and walking the long, silent path to the executive suites. It felt like walking to my own execution, or perhaps my coronation. Her office was exactly as I had imagined it, a vast expanse of minimalist elegance. One wall was entirely glass, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of Central Park. The furniture was sparse and modern, the art on the walls abstract and expensive. The air itself seemed different in here, cleaner, rarefied. She was standing by the window when I entered, looking down at the city below, a silhouette against the blinding afternoon sun. "Close the door, Liam," she said, without turning around. I did as I was told, the heavy door clicking shut behind me with a sound of finality. "We have a problem," she said, finally turning to face me. Her face was set in a grim, determined mask. "Our controlling stake in the Phoenix Group is being threatened by a hostile takeover bid. It's a vulture fund out of Singapore. They're trying to tear it apart and sell the pieces. We have 72 hours to prepare a defense strategy for the board." She paused, her steel blue eyes locking onto mine. "My entire team is already at capacity. I need another set of hands and another brain. I need you to be mine." It wasn't a question, it was a command. And I have never in my life felt a more profound sense of purpose. "Whatever you need," I said, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. For the next 3 days, her office became my entire world. The sun rose and set outside the great glass wall, but it meant nothing to us. Time was measured in conference calls, legal documents, and the dwindling number of hours until the board meeting. We didn't leave. Food was sent up. I napped for an hour at a time on the supple leather couch in the corner, waking to the scent of her perfume and the soft clicking of her keyboard. At first, the dynamic was strictly professional, a master and an apprentice in the crucible of corporate warfare. "Liam, I need the Q2 cash flow projections, now. Liam, find me a precedent for this kind of poison pill defense." I moved with a speed and efficiency that surprised even myself. I was no longer the timid boy from Queens. I was her instrument, her weapon. I anticipated her needs, pulling up a document moments before she asked for it, highlighting a key clause in a contract I knew she would focus on. We fell into a rhythm, a seamless dance of 2 minds focused on a single goal. The formal barrier of Miss Vance slowly, imperceptibly, eroded. It became Eleanor, and I was no longer Porter, I was Liam. The turning point came on the second night. It was almost 3 in the morning. We had just gotten off a brutal call with our lawyers in London. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. We were both silent, staring at the numbers on a massive screen, the figures blurring before my eyes. The city below was a sea of glittering diamonds, a silent, sleeping world that had no idea of the war being waged in this glass tower. Eleanor sighed, a soft, human sound of exhaustion that seemed utterly alien coming from her. She pushed herself away from the massive mahogany desk and walked over to a polished teak cabinet I hadn't paid much attention to. She opened it, revealing a collection of crystal glassware and a decanter filled with an amber liquid. "I think," she said, her back to me, "we have more than earned this." She took out 2 heavy, lowball glasses. The sound of the crystal stopper being removed from the decanter was the only sound in the room. She poured 2 generous measures of the whiskey, the liquid catching the light like liquid gold. She turned and held one of the glasses out to me. "To survival," she said, her voice a low murmur. I took the glass, our fingers brushing for a second time. This time, the spark was warmer, less shocking. It was a current of shared exhaustion and camaraderie. I took a sip. The whiskey was smooth and peaty, a fire that spread slowly through my chest, chasing away some of the chill of fatigue. We stood there for a moment, not as CEO and intern, but as 2 soldiers in a trench, sharing a moment of respite. "Does it ever stop?" I asked, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. It was too familiar, too bold. She looked at me, a question in her eyes. "The pressure," I clarified. "The feeling that if you stop moving for even a second, you'll be devoured." She took a slow sip of her whiskey, her gaze drifting back to the window. "No," she said simply. "It never stops. You just get better at living with it. You build higher walls." She gestured vaguely at the city. "They see this," she said, her voice laced with a weariness I had never heard before. "The success, the power. They don't see the cost. They don't see the 16-hour days, the missed birthdays, the friendships that wither on the vine because you can never, ever switch off." She swirled the whiskey in her glass. "My husband, Richard, he believes my work is a form of elaborate, expensive therapy. He's skiing in Gstaad this week. He sent a postcard." She said it with a complete lack of emotion, a flat statement of fact that was more damning than any tirade. It was the first real crack I had seen in her marble facade, a glimpse into the profound loneliness of her life. "You must think I'm pathetic," she said, a faint, mirthless smile on her lips. The powerful CEO complaining about her gilded cage. "No," I said, and I meant it. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met." She looked at me then, really looked at me. The mask of command was gone. In its place was just a woman, vulnerable and tired. "And what about you, Liam? What about your life outside these walls, your girlfriend? Sarah, isn't it?" I was taken aback that she remembered the name from our brief conversation weeks ago. "Yes, Sarah." I hesitated. "She's wonderful. She's studying to be a teacher. She wants a house in the suburbs, a dog, 2.5 kids, a normal life." And you don't?" Eleanor asked, her gaze steady, penetrating. I looked down into my glass, at the swirling amber liquid. "I don't know what I want," I confessed, the whiskey loosening my tongue. "But I know it isn't that. I have this hunger, this fear of being ordinary, of waking up at 50 and realizing I never took a risk, never really tested my limits. Sarah doesn't understand that. She looks at me sometimes like I'm speaking a different language." In that moment, the 50 floors separating us from the rest of the world felt like a million miles. The vast difference in our age and station in life evaporated, burned away by the heat of shared confession. We were just 2 people, a man and a woman, adrift in the same sea of ambition and loneliness. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved energy. We had moved from the desk to the leather couches, and now we were sitting only a few feet apart. I could smell the whiskey on her breath, mingled with that intoxicating perfume. I could see the pulse beating softly in the hollow of her throat. The professional line had been crossed. The personal line had been crossed. Now there was only one line left. A shimmering, dangerous wire stretched between us in the pre-dawn quiet, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that we were both about to fall. The silence that followed my confession was a living thing. It filled the vast office, pressing in on us, thick and heavy with everything that had just been said and everything that hadn't. The low hum of the building's climate control, a sound I had long since tuned out, was suddenly deafening. We sat on the leather couches, separated by a few feet of expensive upholstery that felt like a chasm. I could not bring myself to look at her, so I stared into my glass, at the way the dim light refracted through the whiskey, casting shifting amber patterns on my hand. I had just laid my soul bare to Eleanor Vance, the CEO, the marble goddess. I had confessed my deepest fears to a woman who seemed to have none. I fully expected the cold mask of command to snap back into place, for her to dismiss me with a curt, clinical observation and send me on my way. I waited for the axe to fall. Instead, she did something else. She set her glass down on the low table between us, the crystal making a soft, definitive click against the wood. Then, she rose to her feet with that fluid, contained grace she possessed. She didn't look at me. She walked slowly, deliberately, towards the great glass wall that served as the northern boundary of her world. It was a slow retreat, or perhaps a slow advance towards a different kind of precipice. I watched her go, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. This was it. The conversation was over. The brief, intoxicating connection was severed. I should have stayed put, let her have her space, collected my things and my shattered dignity, and vanished back into the anonymity of the night. But my body moved before my mind could protest. As if pulled by an invisible string, I found myself standing, my own half-empty glass left forgotten on the table. I followed her. Every step I took across that plush, silent carpet was a conscious decision. It was a step away from Sarah, a step away from my simple, comprehensible life, and a step towards a complication so profound I couldn't begin to fathom it. I was walking towards the fire, knowing full well I would be burned. She didn't seem surprised when I came to stand beside her. We stood in silence for a long time, side by side, our shoulders almost touching, looking down at the city. From this height, the world was a beautiful, impersonal thing. The traffic on Fifth Avenue was a silent river of light. The buildings were a forest of illuminated geometry, and the millions of people in them were an abstract concept. Up here, in this silent, sterile cage of glass and steel, the rules of the world below seemed distant and irrelevant. I could see our reflections in the window, two ghostly figures superimposed over the sprawling map of Manhattan. A powerful, elegant woman and a young, lost man, both of us adrift. My hand was resting on a cool metal windowsill beside me. Her hand was there too, only inches away. My mind was screaming at me, a frantic litany of warnings. Think of Sarah. Think of your career. This is your boss. This is madness. But the air was too thick, the whiskey was too warm in my veins, and the proximity of her was a magnetic force that overruled all rational thought. I let my fingers drift sideways, a slow, deliberate movement of a single inch, until the tip of my index finger brushed against the back of her hand. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure energy that shot up my arm. I expected her to recoil, to snatch her hand away as if she'd been burned. I held my breath, waiting for the rejection. But she didn't move. She remained perfectly, impossibly still. Her only reaction was a slight, almost imperceptible intake of breath. It was the smallest of signs, but it was everything. It was permission. The voices of reason in my head fell silent, drowned out by the thunderous roar of my own heartbeat. I looked from our hands to her face, to her reflection in the glass. I saw the tension in her jaw, the profound loneliness in her eyes that she tried so hard to conceal. And in that moment, all I wanted in the world was to erase that loneliness, if only for a minute. I lifted my hand, the one that wasn't touching hers. It seemed to move through the air with an agonizing slowness, through the charged space between us. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for her face. This was the final step, the leap from the cliff. I gently cupped her jaw, my thumb coming to rest on her cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft, a stark contrast to the iron control she projected. I felt a slight tremor run through her. I expected her to pull back, to slap my hand away, to fire me on the spot and banish me from her world forever. Instead, she did the opposite. She closed her eyes. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender, a quiet lowering of her final defense. It was the most vulnerable, most intimate thing I had ever witnessed. In that silent gesture, She gave me everything I didn't even know I was asking for. I leaned in, closing the last few inches between us. The first touch of our lips was soft, hesitant, a question asked in the dark. It was the taste of her, a faint trace of expensive lipstick, and the smoky, peaty flavor of the whiskey we had shared. It was a moment of pure, terrifying discovery, the confirmation of a truth that had been humming between us for hours. For a heartbeat, we were still, suspended in the enormity of our transgression. Then, a small, wounded sound escaped her throat, a sound that was part sigh, part moan, and the dam broke. The kiss deepened, instantly transforming from a gentle question into a desperate, hungry answer. All the pent-up tension, the late-night confessions, the shared exhaustion, and the forbidden longing poured into it. It was a raw, bruising collision of two solitudes. My youthful, frantic passion met her controlled, long-dormant desire, and the result was explosive. My hand slid from her jaw into her hair, my fingers sinking into the perfect, elegant chignon, dislodging pins, finally ruining that flawless perfection I had so admired from afar. Her hand came up, not to push me away, but to grip my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve, holding on as if she were drowning. Our bodies pressed together, the heat of us a stark contrast to the cold, unfeeling glass at our backs. The entire city of New York, with its millions of lights and millions of rules, blurred into a meaningless, swirling chaos below. The only world that existed was here, in this kiss, at the top of the world, where we had finally, irrevocably, crossed a line from which there would be no return. The kiss was a whirlpool, pulling us down into a place where time and consequence ceased to exist. The city lights below were a distant, forgotten galaxy. My entire universe had shrunk to the space of this woman's mouth, the taste of whiskey and ambition on her tongue, the desperate strength in the way her fingers were tangled in my hair, pulling me closer. It was a kiss that consumed, a fire that melted weeks of restraint into a single, molten moment. It couldn't last. It was too intense, too unsustainable. She was the one who broke it. She pulled back, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her lips red and slightly swollen. Her ice blue eyes, now dark with a desire that mirrored my own, held my gaze. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. For a terrifying second, I thought she would push me away, that the cold reality would come crashing back in. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, doubt, maybe even fear, but it was consumed almost instantly by a wave of raw, determined need. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She took my hand, her grip firm, and led me away from the window, away from the ghostly reflections of our transgression. She led me towards the heart of her power, the massive, polished mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. It was not a retreat. It was an escalation. When we reached the desk, she turned to face me, her body framed by the skyline. She raised her hands, not to push me away, but to slowly, deliberately take the end of my silk tie. She undid the knot I had so carefully tied that morning, her movements precise, her eyes never leaving mine. The tie came loose, and she let it fall to the floor. Then, her fingers went to the buttons of my shirt. One by one, she unfastened them, her knuckles brushing against my chest, leaving a trail of fire on my skin. The air crackled with a tension so thick I could barely breathe. When my shirt was open, she pushed it back off my shoulders, her palms flat against my skin, hot and demanding. My own hands, clumsy and trembling with a desperate eagerness, went to the zipper at the back of her dress. The sound of it coming down was a loud, deliberate rasp in the silent office, a sound of finality. I pushed the heavy fabric of her dress off her shoulders, revealing the woman beneath the armor. She wore a simple, elegant bra of black lace, a fragile, feminine thing that was a shocking contrast to the severe power of her professional attire. Beneath the armor of the CEO was a woman, and she was beautiful. My hands, now bolder, traced the elegant line of her collarbones, the smooth, soft skin of her shoulders. She was not soft and girlish like Sarah. Her body was toned, athletic, the body of a woman who commanded discipline over herself in all things. I could feel the lean muscle in her back, the firm, mature curve of her hips. I leaned in and kissed her again, my mouth finding the hollow of her throat, the pulse that beat there, wild and frantic. I could taste her perfume, that expensive floral scent, now mingled with the salty tang of her skin. A low groan rumbled in her chest, a sound of surrender that made my head spin. My hands slid down her back, over the smooth curve of her spine, to her hips, pulling her flush against me. I could feel the heat of her through the thin fabric of her lingerie. This was real. This was happening. With a lithe, powerful movement, she turned and hoisted herself onto the edge of the desk, her long legs parting slightly to make room for me. She was perched on her throne of power, the very place where she signed billion-dollar deals and decided the fates of companies, and she was looking at me with an expression of raw, unadulterated hunger. It was a look that stripped away my last shred of restraint. I fumbled with the buckle of my own belt, my fingers clumsy and stupid with haste. I kicked off my shoes, pushed down my trousers and briefs, my movements frantic, animalistic. All the while, her eyes watched me, dark and approving. I moved between her legs, my hands finding her waist. I leaned in to kiss her, but she turned her head slightly. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice a husky whisper that was both a plea and an order. I obeyed. I looked into her eyes as I entered her. The feeling was indescribable. The heat, the wetness, the tight clenching of her body around me. She threw her head back, a sharp, ragged gasp tearing from her throat. It was not a sound of pain, but of a pleasure so intense it bordered on it. It was the sound of a wall, meticulously built over years, finally shattering. The storm broke. There was no tenderness, no slow exploration. It was a frantic, desperate coupling, a release of all the pressure that had been building between us for weeks. My movements were hard, fast, driven by a pure, primal need. And she met me, thrust for thrust, her hips rising off the desk to meet mine. She was not a passive participant. She was the conductor of this chaotic orchestra. Her hands were everywhere, gripping my shoulders, her nails digging into my skin, then sliding down my back to pull me deeper inside her. "Yes," she breathed, the word a raw, guttural command. "Like that. Don't stop." The sounds filled the silent, cavernous office. The wet, slick sound of our bodies colliding, a frantic, primal rhythm that echoed off the glass walls, our ragged, heavy breathing, our gasps for air, and her voice. The composed, measured alto of the boardroom was gone, replaced by the unrestrained cries of a woman consumed by pleasure. She moaned my name, the sound a mix of desperation and ecstasy that drove me wilder. I felt the cool, polished wood of the desk against her skin as I drove into her, the city lights outside a swirling, meaningless blur of color. The only reality was the feeling of her body, the scent of sex and perfume that filled the air, the incredible, overwhelming sensation of being inside this magnificent, powerful woman. I could feel her coiling tighter around me, her body trembling. Her head was thrown back, her neck arched, a cord of tension. "Liam!" she cried out, her voice breaking, her body convulsing around me in a powerful, shattering orgasm. The sight of her, the sound of her complete and utter abandon, was my undoing. Watching her lose that ironclad control was the most erotic thing I had ever witnessed. It pushed me over the edge, and I emptied myself into her with a deep, shuddering groan, my own release, a violent, explosive answer to hers. For a long moment we stayed like that, tangled together on her desk, the only sound in the universe our harsh, ragged breathing, our hearts hammering against each other. The frantic energy receded, leaving a vacuum in its wake. The storm had passed, and in the deafening silence of its eye, I slowly became aware of what we had done. I was naked, spent, and trembling in the office of my CEO, and below us, the city of New York, a silent, unknowing witness, was beginning to stir for a new day. The silence that descended after the storm was more profound, more terrifying than any noise. It was a vacuum, sucking the heat and life out of the room, leaving behind only the cold, stark reality of what we had done. We untangled ourselves from each other on her desk with a clumsy, awkward haste, the spell shattered. I couldn't look at her. I scrambled for my clothes, which were strewn on the floor like evidence of a crime. My hands shook as I tried to button my shirt, the simple task suddenly feeling impossibly complex. She was silent, her back to me, gracefully pulling her dress back on, zipping it up with a sharp, definitive sound. The powerful, commanding CEO was reassembling herself, putting her armor back on piece by piece. The passionate, unrestrained woman from moments ago had vanished, as if she had never been. When I was finally dressed, I stood there, a pathetic, disheveled mess in the center of her perfect, ordered world. She turned to face me. The flush of passion was gone from her cheeks. Her expression was a cool, unreadable mask. Her hair was a mess, the only remaining evidence of our madness, and she seemed oblivious to it. "You should go, Liam," she said, her voice even, controlled, betraying no emotion. There was no tenderness, no shared intimacy. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a dismissal. I was no longer her partner in a secret shared passion. I was a problem to be managed, a complication to be removed from the scene. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "I'll handle the presentation to the board myself," she added, a final, clean severance. "You've done enough." I fled. I didn't say a word, just nodded mutely and escaped her office, closing the door softly behind me. The walk through the empty, silent bullpen was a walk of shame. I grabbed my bag from my cubicle and hurried to the elevators, my body screaming with a toxic mixture of adrenaline, shame, and a strange, hollow euphoria. The city was just beginning to wake up as I stepped out onto the street. The first rays of dawn were painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gray, but the light brought no comfort. The streets, which had looked so beautiful and abstract from her window 50 floors up, were now gritty, real, and accusatory. The early morning sanitation trucks, the weary faces of night shift workers heading home, the first trickle of commuters, they were all part of a world I no longer belonged to. I felt marked, tainted, a criminal hiding in plain sight. The subway ride to Queens was torture. I slumped into a seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone, convinced that my guilt was a visible aura, that everyone could smell Eleanor's perfume and our sin on me. Every rattle of the train was like a judgment. I got off at my stop and walked the familiar blocks to my apartment, but nothing felt familiar. The cheerful bakery on the corner, the old man who always swept his stoop at this hour, they were props in a life that was no longer mine. I fumbled with my keys, my hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the lock. The act of opening my own front door felt like a violation. I pushed the door open, expecting to find the apartment dark and empty. Instead, a small lamp was on in the living room, and curled up on our lumpy, comfortable couch was Sarah. She was asleep, her head pillowed on a cushion, a novel fallen open on her chest. She had waited up for me. The sight of her, so innocent and peaceful, was like a physical blow. It knocked the air from my lungs. This was the life I was destroying. This was the heart I was breaking, and she didn't even know it yet. The soft click of the door closing was enough to stir her. She blinked, her eyes hazy with sleep, and then she saw me. A beautiful, radiant smile of pure relief spread across her face. "Liam," she breathed, sitting up quickly. "Oh my God, I was so worried. You didn't answer your phone." She rushed over to me, her arms wrapping around my neck, pulling me into a hug. I went rigid. Her embrace, which had always been my safest harbor, now felt like a cage of fire. Her familiar scent, something clean like green apples and laundry detergent, was an assault, warring with the phantom ghost of Eleanor's expensive perfume that I was convinced was clinging to every fiber of my being. I hugged her back stiffly, my body a betrayal. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, the words tasting like ash. "The Phoenix Project. It was a complete nightmare. We worked all through the night. My phone died. The lies came so easily, it terrified me." She pulled back, her brow furrowed with concern as she studied my face. "You look awful. You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I thought. "I am one." "You must be starving. And you need a shower. Come on, I'll make you some breakfast." Her kindness was a form of exquisite torture. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fall on my knees and confess everything, to have her either forgive me or condemn me. Anything to end this unbearable tension. Instead, I just nodded and followed her like a condemned man towards the kitchen. The breakfast table was my scaffold. Sarah moved around our small, cheerful kitchen with a familiar, loving efficiency. The smell of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling, scents that had always meant home, comfort, and lazy Sunday mornings, now turned my stomach. Each homey, domestic sound, the clink of plates, the scrape of a spatula on the pan was an accusation. I sat at the table, a stranger at my own execution, while my mind was a war zone. Flashes of the night before kept replaying against my will, graphic and intrusive. Eleanor's head thrown back against the mahogany desk, the sharp, intoxicating scent of her skin, the sound of her cry as she came undone. These images, so potent and pornographic, were desecrating this clean, sunlit space, this temple of our simple, shared life. "Here you go," Sarah said, placing a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast in front of me. She sat down opposite me, her face bright with love. "So, tell me everything. Did you save the day? Did Miss Vance even say thank you?" She smiled, a teasing, proud little smile. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I thought I was going to be sick. I couldn't eat. I picked up my fork and pushed the eggs around on my plate. I took a sip of coffee, and it tasted bitter, like poison. Sarah's cheerful chatter about her previous day, about a funny thing one of her students had said, about a movie she wanted to see, washed over me, the words meaningless. I was looking at her messy brown hair tied up in a bun, at the small smudge of flour on her cheek, at the open, trusting love in her eyes, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty chasm. It was as if I was watching a movie of my own life, and the man on the screen was a stranger. Her chatter eventually trailed off as she noticed my silence, my untouched plate. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion, and then a flicker of hurt. "Liam, are you okay? You seem a million miles away." I looked up and forced myself to meet her eyes. It was like looking into the sun. "I'm just tired," I mumbled. Exhausted. The project was a lot. She wasn't convinced. I could see it in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't possibly imagine the scale of it. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Well, you're home now," she said softly. Her touch was warm and real, and I had to use every ounce of my willpower not to flinch away from it. The contrast between her hand and the memory of Eleanor's fingers digging into my shoulders was a whiplash that left me dizzy. I sat there, her hand on mine, the smell of breakfast growing cold, and I felt the truth settle into my bones. The boy who had loved this girl, the boy who had sat at this table 1,000 times, was gone. He had died last night, 50 floors up, in an office that overlooked the world. In his place sat this creature, this hollowed-out imposter, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. The guilt was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical presence, a cold, heavy entity sitting in my stomach, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that I would carry its weight forever. The week that followed our encounter was a special kind of hell. I lived my life as if through a pane of dirty glass, the world muted and distant. At home, I was a ghost. I moved through the apartment I shared with Sarah, with a quiet, leaden guilt that poisoned everything. Every meal we shared, every movie we watched, every night we lay in bed together, her sleeping soundly. While I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying a frantic, forbidden movie was an act of profound deception. She knew something was wrong. My distance was a tangible thing, a third person in our relationship. I would see the hurt and confusion in her eyes, and I would offer clumsy excuses about stress at work, lies that felt like swallowing shards of glass. My life had become a performance, and I was forgetting all my lines. At the office, I was a nervous wreck. I avoided the executive floor like it was radioactive. I took the stairs to avoid the elevators, terrified of a chance encounter. I buried myself in meaningless work, my focus shattered. I thought it was over. A moment of shared madness, a catastrophic lapse in judgment that we would both silently agree to bury forever. I told myself it was for the best, that the guilt I felt was my penance, a sickness I had to sweat out. But beneath the guilt, a darker, more persistent feeling festered. A deep, aching hunger. I missed her. I missed the intoxicating terror of her presence, the weight of her intelligence, the memory of her body. I was an addict suffering through a forced withdrawal, and I was failing. Then, 10 days after that night, the email arrived. It appeared in my inbox at midday, a single, stark line of text from her account. The subject was Carlisle proposal. The body of the message was even more cryptic. Your input is required for a final review. Suite 1205, 6 p.m. My blood turned to ice. There was no Carlisle proposal. I had searched the company servers. It didn't exist. It was a code, a summons. My hands began to shake. A part of me, the part that still clung to Sarah and sanity, screamed at me to delete it, to pretend I never saw it, to run, but that part of me had grown weak and thin. The addict, starved for a fix, was so much stronger. A wave of something dark and thrilling washed over me, relief. The decision had been taken out of my hands. I wasn't the initiator of a new sin. I was merely following an order from my CEO. It was a flimsy, pathetic justification, but it was all I needed. At 5:30, I left the office, telling my supervisor I had a dentist appointment. The subway ride into the Upper East Side felt like a journey to another planet. This time, I wasn't fleeing a crime scene. I was heading towards one. I felt a grim sense of purpose. I saw my reflection in the dark glass of the subway car window, a young man in a slightly rumpled suit, his eyes too bright, his face pale with a mixture of terror and anticipation. I looked like a man walking toward his destiny or his doom. I wasn't sure there was a difference. The Carlisle Hotel was a fortress of old-world luxury and discretion. The lobby was quiet, opulent, smelling of money and lilies. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces trained to show nothing. No one gave me a second glance as I crossed the marble floor to the elevators. In front of the polished wooden door of Suite 1205, I hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs. I raised my hand to knock, my knuckles hovering just inches from the wood. This was the last moment of my old life. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and there she was. The sight of her stole the air from my lungs. She wasn't wearing a power suit or a dress. She wore a simple, elegant robe of dark green silk, tied loosely at the waist. Her hair was down, falling in soft ash blonde waves around her shoulders. Her face was free of its usual severe makeup, and she looked younger, softer. The lighting in the room behind her was low and warm, and I could hear the faint, melancholic notes of a jazz piano playing softly. She hadn't just summoned me. She had prepared for me. She had curated this space, this moment. She had built a sanctuary for our sin. She didn't smile. She simply looked at me for a long moment, then stepped back, holding the door open for me to enter. I stepped inside, and she closed the door behind me. The click of the latch echoed the finality of my decision. The suite was beautiful, all cream colors and dark wood, with a stunning view of the city, but my eyes were only on her. We stood in silence for a moment, the jazz music filling the space between us. Then, she slowly reached up and untied the silk belt of her robe. She let it fall open. Underneath, she wore a delicate set of lingerie in the same shade of black lace as before. It was a deliberate echo of our first time, but this was different. This wasn't a secret revealed in a moment of frantic passion. This was a private exhibition. This was for me. My throat was dry. I walked towards her, and this time, I was the one to initiate the kiss. It was not like the first one. There was no desperation, no frantic bruising of lips. It was a slow, deep, exploratory kiss. A rediscovery. I tasted the faint trace of wine on her tongue. When we finally broke apart, she led me by the hand towards the massive, king-sized bed with its pristine white sheets. What followed was not a storm, but a slow, deliberate lesson in pleasure, and she was the professor. This was not the frantic, almost violent release of energy from her office. This was an act of profound, decadent intimacy. She lay back against the pillows and simply watched me, as I slowly, reverently removed my own clothes. Then, I knelt on the floor beside the bed. I was there to worship, and she knew it. My mouth, my tongue, explored her with a devotion I had never known I possessed. I learned the unique taste of her, the musky scent of her arousal, the geography of her most intimate place. I listened to the sounds she made, the low moans that rumbled in her chest, the sharp intake of her breath as I found a place that made her tremble. I watched her hands clutch the white sheets, her knuckles turning white, her back arching as I brought her to a shuddering, sighing climax. It was an offering, and she accepted it. She pulled me onto the bed with her then, into the cool, high-thread count sheets that felt like silk against my skin. We spent what felt like hours exploring each other's bodies. Her experience was a revelation. She guided my hands with her own, showing me the exact pressure she liked, the rhythm that drove her wild. She taught me about the female body in a way no fumbling teenage encounter ever could. It was a masterclass in sensuality. In turn, she explored me with a focused, intense curiosity, her hands and mouth learning my own responses, discovering things that made me arch and groan in a way I never had with Sarah. We made love slowly, deliberately, with our eyes open, watching each other, learning each other. The frantic energy of our first encounter was replaced with a deep, consuming connection. This was not just about sex. It was about knowledge, about power, about a forbidden, shared intimacy that was more intoxicating than any drug. When her final orgasm came, it was different from the first time. It was not a sharp, shattering cry, but a deep, prolonged wave of pleasure that started deep inside her and rolled through her body. She pulled me down with her, her legs wrapped around me, her voice whispering my name over and over against my ear, her body trembling violently. We found our release together, a shared, shuddering crest in the warm, safe darkness of that room. Afterward, we didn't spring apart. We didn't scramble for our clothes in awkward silence. We lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, our breathing slowly returning to normal. She let me hold her, her head resting on my chest, my arm wrapped around her. The jazz music still played softly. The city lights twinkled outside the window. For the first time, there was no guilt, no panic. In the sanctuary of this hotel room, the outside world and all its rules and consequences ceased to exist. There was no Sarah, no Richard, no Vance Capital. There were only two people, a man and a woman, breathing in unison in a stolen pocket of time. It was a fragile, temporary peace, but in that moment, it felt like salvation. The peace we found in that hotel room was a dangerous, addictive substance. It did not end when we checked out. That first rendezvous in the Carlisle suite was not a finale. It was an overture. It set the stage for a new, secret chapter of our lives, one lived in the stolen hours and hidden corners of New York City. The Carlisle proposal became our shorthand, a coded message that would appear in my inbox every week or two, a summons that made my heart leap with a now familiar mixture of guilt and elation. Our sanctuary was no longer just the bedroom. It was the affair itself. The initial frantic energy of our first encounter had been replaced by a deep, resonant intimacy. The physical act, as incredible as it was, became a gateway to something far more profound and far more treacherous, an emotional entanglement. We began to crave more than just the anonymous luxury of a hotel suite. We wanted context. We wanted the illusion of a normal life, even if we could only have it for a few hours at a time. Our first venture into the real world was terrifying. Eleanor chose a small, dimly lit French bistro in the West Village, a place far from the financial district and the neighborhoods where her society friends congregated. Sitting across from her at a table for two, with a candle flickering between us, felt like the most natural and the most illicit act in the world. I watched her laugh, a genuine, throaty laugh at a story I told, and I realized I had never heard that sound before. In the boardroom, her voice was a weapon. In the bedroom, it was a whisper of pleasure, but here it was the sound of a woman enjoying a moment of simple happiness, and it was devastatingly beautiful. In these stolen evenings, the dynamic between us began to shift and deepen. She became my mentor in a way that transcended the corporate world. She saw the raw ambition in me, the same hunger that had driven her, and she began to cultivate it. She would listen to my half-formed ideas about the market, dissecting them with her sharp intellect, pushing me to think bigger, to be bolder. "That's a good thought, Liam," she'd say, swirling the red wine in her glass. "But it's a tactic, not a strategy. You're still thinking about the next move. I need you to think about the entire board." She gave me books to read not just on finance, but on history, philosophy, and military strategy. She was shaping me, molding my mind, giving me the education that no university could provide. She was crafting the man she wanted to talk to, an intellectual and emotional equal. In return, I became her confessor, the one person in the world who didn't want anything from Eleanor Vance, the CEO. I just wanted Eleanor. In the quiet intimacy of our bubble, she began to unburden herself. She told me more about her husband, Richard. He wasn't a villain, he was just absent. A man she had married young. A union that was more of a merger between two powerful families than a romance. They lived parallel lives, intersecting only at the sterile charity galas and political fundraisers that their social status demanded. She described her home, a palatial apartment on Fifth Avenue, as a beautiful, silent museum where she was the most valuable and most lonely exhibit. "He doesn't see me," she told me one night, her voice quiet and devoid of self-pity. "He sees a hostess, a business asset, the mother of his grown children. The woman I was, the girl who wanted to be an architect, she vanished a long time ago." I listened, and I understood. I became the keeper of that vanished girl. With me, she could talk about her frustrations, her weariness with the constant battles, her secret fear that she had sacrificed her soul for her empire. I was the only person who saw the cracks in the marble, and instead of seeing weakness, I saw a strength that was all the more profound for the vulnerabilities it protected. My role shifted from worshiper to confidant, and in a strange way, to protector. I felt an overwhelming urge to shield this powerful woman from the loneliness that haunted her. This profound emotional connection made my life with Sarah an unbearable hypocrisy. Our small Queens apartment, once a haven of warmth and comfort, began to feel like a stage set for a life I was no longer interested in living. Sarah's world, with its innocent chatter about her students, her plans for our future, her simple, uncomplicated love, seemed painfully small and naive. One Saturday, she was excited, showing me paint swatches for the bedroom. "What do you think, Liam? Misty Harbor or Morning Dew?" I stared at the two nearly identical shades of beige, and my mind was a million miles away, replaying a debate Eleanor and I had had the night before about geopolitical risk in emerging markets. I looked at Sarah's hopeful, expectant face, and what I felt was not love, but a deep, soul-crushing impatience, followed by a wave of self-loathing. I was becoming a monster. The guilt hadn't vanished. It had just been buried under layers of justification and the intoxicating thrill of my secret life. Our affair became a closed loop, a self-sustaining ecosystem of need and fulfillment. The emptiness in her life drove her to me. My relationship with her fueled my ambition and made my life with Sarah feel inadequate, which in turn drove me back into Eleanor's arms. The sex was the current that powered it all, but the engine was our emotional codependence. We were two people who felt profoundly unseen in our real lives, and we had found in each other a perfect, validating mirror. She saw in me a brilliant, passionate man full of potential. I saw in her a magnificent, vulnerable woman, not just a corporate titan. We never used the word love. It was too conventional, too mundane for what we had. Besides, to name it would be to acknowledge the true scale of our betrayal, and we couldn't afford that. Our relationship existed outside of language, in the charged glances across a dinner table, in the shared silence of a walk through the park, in the way she would reach for my hand under the table when she thought no one was looking. It was a fantasy, a meticulously constructed world built for two, but the emotions were more real and more potent than anything I had ever known. We were no longer just having an affair. We were living a secret life, one that was rapidly consuming the real one. We had found our sanctuary, but it was built on a fault line, and the ground was beginning to tremble beneath our feet. The sanctuary we had built in quiet hotel rooms and anonymous restaurants began to feel less like a refuge and more like a gilded cage. Our affair, once a dangerous secret, had settled into a routine, and routine is the enemy of the kind of high-stakes thrill we were living on. The addiction demanded a stronger dose, a greater risk. A dangerous restlessness began to creep into our stolen moments, a hand held for a second too long in a crowded elevator, a shared look across a conference room that burned with an intimacy far too hot for a professional setting. We were becoming reckless, drunk on our own private world, starting to believe we were invincible. The carefully managed boundaries that had kept us safe were beginning to fray. The opportunity for a new, more profound transgression came on a Tuesday. Sarah, bubbly and excited, announced she was going away for the weekend, a bachelorette party for a college friend in Boston. Friday morning to Sunday night, the moment she said it, the empty apartment loomed in my mind, not as a lonely space to be endured, but as a stage, a vacuum waiting to be filled. The thought was immediate, intrusive, and deeply shameful. I pushed it down, telling myself I would enjoy the quiet, catch up on work, miss her terribly. I was a good liar, especially to myself. I was on the phone with Eleanor that Thursday night, a conversation that was ostensibly about work but had long since become our primary means of contact. She was complaining in her dry, understated way about a weekend charity obligation at her house in the Hamptons. I'll have to spend 48 hours smiling at people I despise while they compliment Richard on his new yacht, she sighed. It could be worse, I said, trying to sound casual, my heart starting to pound. I'll be here, rattling around this empty apartment, trying to figure out how the washing machine works. A moment of silence stretched over the line, a silence thick with unspoken possibility. It was my move. I could let the moment pass, retreat to safety, but the addict was at the wheel. The words came out before I could stop them, a reckless, thrilling whisper. You should come here. The silence that followed was deafening. I had done it. I had invited her into my home, into Sarah's home. I could almost hear her calculating the risk, the sheer insane audacity of it. I expected her to laugh, to call me a fool, to shut it down immediately. Instead, her voice came back, a low, dangerous murmur that sent a jolt straight to my groin. When? Friday night felt like the longest night of my life. After getting a text from Sarah that she had arrived safely in Boston, I paced my small apartment like a caged animal. This was not the excited anticipation of a rendezvous at the Carlisle. This was the raw, nervous terror of a saboteur about to blow up his own life. At 10 o'clock, a discreet text from her. I'm a block away. I met her on the street, feeling like a spy in a cheap movie. She stepped out of a black taxi, a vision of impossible elegance in a simple black dress and a camel hair coat, looking completely and utterly alien on my drab Queen Street corner. The flickering neon sign of the bodega across the road cast a sickly green light on her perfect, aristocratic face. I ushered her quickly toward my building's entrance, my hand on the small of her back, praying none of my neighbors were looking out their windows. She was a panther, and I was bringing her into a cage full of mice. The air of my shabby, dimly lit lobby seemed to thin around her, unworthy of her lungs. The moment she stepped into my apartment, the transgression became real. I saw my life through her eyes, and I was mortified. The worn-out rug, the slightly crooked painting on the wall, the stack of mail on the counter, the faint, lingering smell of last night's takeout. It was the backdrop of my simple, ordinary life, and her presence in it made it all seem pathetic. She, however, showed no judgment. She moved through the small living room with a slow, deliberate curiosity, like an anthropologist. She ran a single, manicured finger along my dusty bookshelf. Her gaze fell on the collection of framed photos on the mantelpiece, me and my parents, me and my college friends, and a half dozen of me and a smiling, radiant Sarah. She stopped in front of a photo of us from last summer, our arms around each other on a beach. She picked it up, her expression unreadable. Watching Eleanor Vance hold a picture of my girlfriend in the home I shared with her was a moment of surreal, stomach-churning horror. She placed it back down, carefully, without a word. I led her to the bedroom. This was the heart of the desecration. The room was clean. I had made sure of it, but it was undeniably ours. Sarah's stack of paperback novels was on her nightstand. Her floral-scented moisturizer sat next to them. The air itself held the faint, clean scent of her, Eleanor took it all in, her gaze lingering for a moment on Sarah's side of the bed. Then she turned to me, and the look in her eyes was not one of curiosity, but of possession. This time, there was no slow seduction, no languid exploration. It was a desperate, almost violent claiming of territory. She came to me and kissed me, a hard, demanding kiss that tasted of risk and adrenaline. We tore at each other's clothes, buttons popping, fabric tearing, our movements hurried and rough. We fell onto the bed, onto the very sheets I had shared with Sarah only the night before. The act itself was a fever dream of guilt and lust. As I moved inside her, I was acutely, agonizingly aware of everything, of Sarah's pillow just inches from Eleanor's head, of the photo on my nightstand, Sarah's smiling face watching us. The wrongness of it all should have rendered me useless, but instead it was a perverse, powerful aphrodisiac. This was not the reverent worship of the hotel room. This was a raw, frantic fuck, a desperate attempt to erase the world with the sheer force of our bodies. Every thrust felt like an act of rebellion, a nail in the coffin of my old life. The sounds we made were not the moans of luxurious pleasure, but the sharp, guttural gasps of two people taking something they had no right to. It was fast, it was rough, and it was over almost as soon as it began. A frantic, shuddering release that left us both breathless and drenched in sweat. The afterglow was not peaceful. It was pure, unfiltered paranoia. We lay there for only a minute, our bodies still connected, listening. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren, every footstep in the hall outside was a potential discovery. The magic of our sanctuary was gone, replaced by the sordid, terrifying reality of our recklessness. She pulled away from me and got dressed with a speed that was almost insulting. The spell was broken. She was once again the CEO, and I was the intern who had just facilitated a catastrophic breach of security. "I have to go," she whispered, not looking at me. She didn't kiss me goodbye. She just slipped out of the bedroom, through the living room, and out the front door, leaving a faint trail of her perfume in her wake. I was left alone, naked and shivering in the wreckage. The bed was a disaster, the sheets a tangled testament to our sin. But she wasn't truly gone. Her scent, that expensive, complex fragrance, had permeated everything. It was on my sheets, on my skin, in the very air of the room. It had overpowered the simple, clean scent of Sarah's life, contaminating my home. I frantically stripped the bed, throwing the sheets in a pile, opening the window to the cold night air, trying to erase her. But it was useless. I had willingly invited the ghost into my home, and now this place, my last refuge of normalcy, was haunted. I had not just trespassed against my relationship. I had desecrated my own world. The act of bringing Eleanor into my home, into Sarah's bed, was a transgression from which there was no recovery. It fundamentally altered the nature of our affair. The secret world we had built, once a sanctuary, now felt like a contaminated zone. The thrill of the risk, which had once been a powerful aphrodisiac, had curdled into a low-grade, persistent paranoia. I became a man living on a wire, and the wire was beginning to fray. I was jumpy, irritable, a stranger in my own skin. I would lash out at Sarah over the smallest things, a misplaced set of keys, a question about my day that felt too probing. Every inquiry felt like an interrogation, every touch an accusation. The cracks in the foundation of my life were starting to show, thin fissures spiderwebbing out from the epicenter of my deceit. I had grown careless, drunk on the belief that Eleanor and I existed in a separate reality where the rules didn't apply. She had given me a small gift a few weeks prior, after we had successfully navigated a particularly difficult negotiation for the Phoenix project. It was a pair of silver cufflinks, simple, elegant, and impossibly expensive. They were engraved with a tiny, stylized V. "A reminder of your value," she had said, her voice a low murmur, as she pressed the box into my hand in a quiet hallway. It was a token of our secret partnership, a symbol of the world she was bringing me into. I wore them once, to a dinner with her, feeling like a king. Then, foolishly, drunkenly, I had taken them off and shoved them into the pocket of my shirt, forgetting them completely. It was a loose thread, and Sarah was the one to pull it. It happened on a Sunday evening. We were doing laundry, one of those mundane domestic rituals that had become a minefield of tension. I was sorting whites, and Sarah was folding my work shirts, her movements quiet and methodical. I was watching a game on television, only half present, my mind replaying a coded, flirtatious email exchange I'd had with Eleanor that afternoon. "Liam?" Sarah's voice was quiet, cutting through the noise of the television. I looked over. She was standing by the laundry basket, her expression unreadable. She was holding something in her open palm. From across the room, it just looked like a piece of metal. As I got closer, my stomach plummeted into my shoes. It was one of the cufflinks. It glinted under the warm light of our living room, the tiny V seeming to mock me. "I found this in your shirt pocket," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "It's beautiful. I've never seen it before." My mind raced, frantically searching for a plausible lie. My throat went dry. "Oh, that," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded like a strangled cough. "Wow, I forgot about that. I found it. On the floor by the elevators at work. Must have fallen off some banker's shirt." I was going to turn it into security. The lie was pathetic. It felt flimsy and transparent even as I said it. We both knew I didn't have the kind of money to even walk into a store that sold something like that. Sarah didn't challenge me. She didn't yell or accuse. She did something far worse. She looked at me, her eyes, those warm, trusting eyes that I had once cherished, were now filled with a deep, bottomless well of sadness and disappointment. She knew I was lying. She didn't know the specifics of the truth, but she knew that the man standing in front of her was a stranger, a liar. "Well," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she placed the cufflink gently on the coffee table, "it's very expensive. Whoever lost it is probably very upset." She turned back to the laundry, her shoulders slumping slightly, and the quiet, deliberate way she continued to fold my shirts was more damning than any scream. The first crack had just become a canyon. The ground had given way, and I was on one side, and she was on the other. I retreated from the room, mumbling something about needing to use the bathroom, needing to escape her knowing, wounded gaze. I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. My reflection in the mirror was a pale, haunted stranger. She knows. She knows. The thought pounded in my head. It was over. The game was up. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, assuming it was a text from one of my friends, a lifeline to normalcy, but the name on the screen was Eleanor. My heart seized. Our rule was no texts unless it was an emergency. I opened the message. It was 4 sentences that shattered the entire fantasy of our affair into a million pieces. "Richard is home, a week early. He found an item on my credit card statement, a charge for the Carlisle. He's asking questions. Do not call, do not text, delete everything. I mean it." I read the message once, then twice, then a third time. The blood drained from my face. All the air left the room. This wasn't the confident, commanding Eleanor I knew. This was a panicked message from a trapped woman. He found a charge for the Carlisle. The name of our sanctuary, now a piece of evidence against her. Delete everything. It was an order of total severance. A severing of the tie that had become my entire world. The illusion of our invincible bubble evaporated in an instant. The powerful, untouchable Eleanor Vance was afraid of her husband. Their affair wasn't some grand, romantic tragedy playing out on a higher plane of existence. It was a sordid, grubby little secret, susceptible to something as mundane as a credit card statement. Her husband, Richard, was no longer a distant, pathetic figure in her stories. He was a real, present, and angry force. A man who could ruin her, and by extension, me. I stood there in the bathroom, the cold tile floor seeming to drop away beneath me. In the other room, I could hear the quiet sounds of Sarah moving about, the rustle of laundry, the soft closing of a drawer. I was trapped between 2 worlds, and both were collapsing around me. Sarah's dawning, heartbreaking suspicion on one side, and Eleanor's terrified, absolute silence on the other. I was completely, utterly alone. The thrill, the power, the intoxicating sense of a shared secret world, it was all gone. All that was left was the cold, metallic taste of fear. I was no longer a player in a dangerous game. I was a fool who had been playing with dynamite, and the fuse had just been lit. I was standing on the precipice, and for the first time, I looked down. The silence that followed her text message was absolute. For 10 agonizing days, the world held its breath. At work, I was a zombie, moving through my final tasks in a fog of sleepless dread. I deleted everything, every email, every coded message. Wiping the digital trail of our affair felt like methodically cutting out pieces of my own memory. The internship ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. On my last day, her assistant summoned me to her office. I walked that familiar path for the final time, my heart a cold, dead stone in my chest. The office was exactly the same, yet utterly different. The air was cold, the view of the city just a view. She was standing behind her desk, the mahogany expanse a barrier between us. The powerful CEO was back in full force, her emotional armor polished to a blinding sheen. There was no trace of the lover who had cried out my name, no sign of the confidant who had confessed her loneliness to me. She didn't meet my eyes for more than a second. "Liam," she said, her voice the calm, measured instrument of the boardroom. "I trust your time here has been productive." "Yes, Miss Vance," I replied, the formality feeling like a slap. She slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the desk. My severance package. Inside, I knew, was the glowing letter of recommendation she had promised. It was the final transaction. My payment for services rendered, and for my silence. "I have no doubt you will have a very successful career," she said. It was a statement, a dismissal, and a warning. Go, be successful, and stay away from my life. I wanted to say something more. "Are you okay? What happened with your husband? Do you ever think of me?" But one look at her face, a mask of impenetrable control, told me that door was welded shut. All of our shared intimacy, our secrets, our sanctuary, it had all been erased. "Thank you," I managed to say. I took the envelope and left her office, her life, for good. I tried to go back. I tried to slot back into the life I had with Sarah, to pretend I was the same man who had left it months before. But it was impossible. The ghost of Eleanor was always between us. My guilt had festered into a strange kind of emotional paralysis. I couldn't touch Sarah without feeling the phantom sensation of Eleanor's skin. I couldn't listen to her plans for our future without my mind drifting to a glass-walled office 50 floors in the sky. I ended it a month later. I sat her down on the lumpy couch that had once felt like home, and I broke her heart. I couldn't tell her the truth. It was too cruel, and perhaps I was too cowardly. I just told her that I was broken, that I had done things during my internship that had changed me, that I wasn't the man she deserved. She cried. She begged for an explanation I couldn't give her, and finally, she looked at me with a gaze that was no longer sad, but clear and cold with realization. She finally saw the stranger I had become. When she walked out of the apartment, out of my life, with a box of her things, I didn't feel the sharp, gut-wrenching pain a man is supposed to feel. I felt a hollow, aching numbness. The affair had been a fire that had burned away my ability to feel anything real. Years passed. Her letter of recommendation was a golden key. Her lessons were my Bible. I climbed the ladder with a ruthless, single-minded focus she would have been proud of. I became the man I thought I wanted to be. I got the job at a competing firm, the 6-figure salary, the apartment in Tribeca with a view. I wore the expensive suits, the handmade shoes, the watch that cost more than my first car. I had, by all external measures, succeeded. But it was a hollow victory. My life was a beautiful, empty apartment. I dated, of course, smart, ambitious, beautiful women. But I was always searching their faces for a shadow of her intelligence, their voices for an echo of her authority. They were all wonderful, and they were all ghosts. No one could compare to the memory of her. The intensity of what we had shared, that fusion of mind, ambition, and flesh, had ruined me for the quiet, patient work of building a real relationship. And she haunts me, in echoes and whispers. I'll be in a tense negotiation, and a female executive will use a phrase, a turn of logic that is pure Eleanor, and for a second, my breath will catch in my throat. I'll be walking down the street, and a woman will pass, leaving a trail of a familiar, complex perfume, and I'll stop dead, my heart aching with a phantom loss. I am a success, and I am utterly, profoundly alone. Tonight, I am sitting in a quiet, expensive bar, the kind I can now afford without thinking. I'm 30 years old, and I feel ancient. I order a whiskey, a Macallan, aged 25 years, her drink. I swirl the dark, amber liquid in the heavy crystal glass, watching the city lights glitter outside the window. It's a different view, but the feeling is the same. The feeling of being separate, looking down on a world I am not truly a part of. I could find her. In this digital age, a few clicks could probably tell me everything. If she's still the CEO, if she's still married, but I never do. To seek out the real woman would be to destroy the ghost. And the ghost, the memory, is all I have left. She is no longer a person to me. She is an idea. She is the embodiment of a choice I made, the moment my life forked onto this gilded, lonely path. I take a sip of the whiskey. It burns, a familiar, expensive fire, the taste of my success, the taste of my regret. I got everything I wanted. I became the man who might have been worthy of her, but in the process, I lost the one thing that mattered, the boy who was capable of a simple, honest love. The affair was the beginning of my life, and I know now, sitting here alone in the dark, that it was the end of it too.